This is the Inclusion Solution Live, the Winters Group's podcast for all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am your host, Brittany J. Harris, Vice President of Learning and Innovation, and I am excited to leverage this medium as yet another opportunity to facilitate dialogue, shift perspectives, and empower action in service of equity, justice, and inclusion. This season, we are demystifying internalized oppression. So I'm super excited, Thamara, to have you on this episode. I'm sure our listeners are just as excited. And so, if you wouldn't mind, Thamara, just sharing a little bit more about yourself, sort of those aspects of identity that influence who you are. Before you do that, though, I'll just share, folks, Thamara is on our learning and innovation team. And more formally, she supports us in developing education experiences for our clients. And so I actually have the pleasure of working with Thamara on our team, and perhaps some of our clients have as well. Thamara, I'll turn it over to you to just share a little bit more informally about yourself and what you're bringing to today's conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brittany. I'm so excited to share with you all kind of my thoughts on this topic and why I feel like it's so important and not really talked about as much, especially in the diversity and inclusion space. So as Brittany said, my name is Thamara. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I identify as South Asian American. I'm a child of two immigrants who came here in the 80s from India. And just growing up here as a first generation millennial in this country, seeing so many different changes in not only the socio-political environment, but also just with how my family, my peers, my communities have, adjusted to life in America has been really interesting. And I feel like being an Asian American in this space puts me in this unique perspective where, as I'm going to talk about with the model minority myth, we're often seen highly in society, but also there are so many very specific and very important systemic oppression for this community that we need to consider. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this with you all and excited to kind of see what we can unpack.
Very, very cool. And so Thamara, I'll be honest, well, you know what, maybe no shade to the other writers, right? No shade to the other writers, because all of them were great. All of them were wonderful in their own right. I really, really, really enjoyed your post, in part because I didn't know the approach that you were going to take. I didn't know the approach or even like the aspect of identity that you were going to be focused on. And so I'd be really, really interested in just understanding like how you or why you even chose to write about this aspect of your identity. And maybe even for the folks, it might be helpful for you to define model minority, or what the model minority myth, and why this experience was particularly salient for you in demystifying internalized oppression.
Awesome. Yeah. So when I first was like, oh, I need to write about, internalized oppression, this was the first thing I thought of. It was very just, oh, of course I'm going to write about this because it's something I think about almost every day. But I really had a term for it until I started doing more social justice work in college and in graduate school. But it's essentially the term model minority is a term that has been used since the civil rights era to describe how the Asian American population in America is exceptionally high achieving, hardworking, seen as very compliant with the standards of the American dream, compliant with the values of the country, and are really respected, educated, often statistically making more money than even white people, statistically, being, CEOs, things like that. And it's something that I think, as an immigrant, or child of immigrants, I was more aware of than my parents themselves.
Mm.
I think I saw their internalization of it and then started questioning, oh, like, are they really being respectful towards you and your identity? I know we talk a lot about assimilation versus exclusion versus inclusion. And I really think of the model minority, and now that it's considered with a lot of research a myth, as a way of, assimilating. I think all immigrants, want to feel included, come to this country for a reason, for a better life, for better opportunities to, be upwardly mobile. And I think this myth has kind of been used as a facade to be like, hey, we are being respectful of you and we appreciate you. But in reality, it's really harmful, especially to other people of color.
You know what? And so I was actually going to ask you to um, just talk a little bit more why this is even a myth, right? Because on its surface, like model minority sounds, really positive. Even in your post, you talk about how, being a role model is something that we grow up to believe is like a good thing. But then you take a critical approach to really emphasizing that this is a myth. And I think in your title, you even said, hey, it's not even a compliment. And so could you just share a little bit more
Mhm.
about, why it is a myth and from your perspective and based on your experiences, why this isn't a compliment and in more ways a form of internalized oppression?
Right. So the model minority myth is a myth because, for me growing up, I felt like, all my teachers loved me. I felt very supported in school, in all the environments I was in. And I personally, as a child at least, didn't feel any, at least direct forms of oppression or
Mm.
racism or sexism, even. And ideally, that sounds great. If we had a racism free, sexism free world, it sounds great. But in reality, it is a myth because, as I've gotten older, I've noticed how much, microaggressions, biases, hate crimes that are out there for people who are Asian American. Even though Asian Americans might be going through these educational systems,
Mm.
that doesn't mean that they are, progressing in their careers as much as white people do. And this is really important, especially when you're thinking of upward mobility. Who are our leaders? Representations of Asian Americans are also this very stereotypical idea of, smart, nerdy, good at math, things like that, or often seen as jokes, similar to,
Mhm.
other people of color. And when I started digging deeper, I was like, this must have come through some reason. It sounds, at one point, my parents immigrated here, and I knew it was because my dad was going to go to graduate school. And so he got a visa to go to graduate school. And looking deeper into that, most of my Asian American peers' parents who immigrated here also came here in terms of a reason for higher education, refugees, things like that. So the term uh, was actually coined by white Americans during the
Mm.
1960s civil rights era. So, first, before the civil rights era, was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, really, the Chinese Exclusion Act is exactly what it is. It's basically making sure that only 105 Chinese people could immigrate each year. And then it was repealed, not because of an act of inclusion, but really to mitigate this relationship with Asian countries, so they could be allies in the war against Japan.
Mm.
So it was really used as a political tool. It's like, oh, we'll welcome you because, we want to be cordial with you in this war that benefits us. Not you, but us, us as white Americans. And then in 1950s and 60s, as the civil rights movements were happening, Asian Americans were starting to increase in this country because of the repeal of the Chinese Inclusion Act, and were seen as rule followers, people who were
Mm.
contributing to society, not complaining, not questioning their treatment. And so essentially, by people who are against the civil rights movement, the argument was, Asian Americans are also minorities in this country. They're not complaining. They think that their life is fine. Why do we need to change things for African Americans? Why do we need like specific rules, like specific changes, and to consider African American culture as important? Why aren't Asian Americans being activists and doing these riots? They're not being violent. They're not seen as violent. And why the real like thing behind it, the real root behind this model minority myth was kind of an excuse for people not to take action for equal rights for people of color, for Black people specifically. So that was something that was really fascinating to me, because I had thought it was something that my generation, the model minority myth, had come up with, just because for my generation of South Asians, Asian Americans, being high achieving and the pressure in academics is really high. So I thought, oh, maybe this is something someone came up with, in the 2000s, in the early 90s. But actually it was something that was used as a tool of oppression against other people of color, which puts the internalization in an interesting spot, where if I internalize this idea, then I am still, perpetuating oppression towards other people of color and myself. Not being an activist for Asian American issues, not being an activist for other people of colors. And it really, I think, opened me to this world of what does it mean to really be an ally? What does it mean to, harness my identity and the implications of that for good?
So this was some really, really, really good historical context. And I think it really just having you unpack and just talk a little bit more about where the model minority myth, like even the model minority thing, like comes from, right? Just hearing you state that really affirms what we often say in our work, and especially in sessions, that what, systems don't just come out of nowhere. Like, it's not just kind of like poof, ideals, norms here, there, they're now here and they oppress. Like people, everyday people in power create systems, create messages, perpetuate norms that oppress. And so what it sounded like, and what I gathered from that, is this whole notion of, what, model minority as a label, as a term, was just another tactical ploy to like perpetuate oppression, specifically, anti-Blackness. And I think that's important to call out, because a lot of times I think it can be difficult to understand how, even as members of a subordinated group, right, people of color, we can, perpetuate exclusion, we can perpetuate uh, oppression and cause harm. And so that's kind of, what my next question for you is going to be. How does, something that is seemingly, or was a positive stereotype, cause harm? Historically, but even in the context of, our current climate, right? Why is this even important for us as practitioners and change agents to call it out?
I definitely think in the context of now, kind of dismantling the model minority myth is so important, because as we're seeing, more like a rise of activism by young people, a rise of activism from people, not just people of color, but people who are passionate about all issues. It's really important, I think, as Asian Americans who have historically, been more silent, especially in the US activism space, to start standing up for other people of color. For example, Black Lives Matter movements. I know there are a lot of Asian American coalitions out there who did a lot of partnerships with that, which is awesome. And same with DACA, Dreamers, and immigrants from, Mexico, and all of the immigration controversy that is out there today. I think it's really important that we understand, what the power of the Asian American identity is, and how we can utilize our power as Asian Americans, as well as how other people of color can also understand that this was kind of this was a tool of oppression for this community that often isn't seen as being oppressed, especially in
Mm-hmm.
America. So I really think it is a kind of mutualistic uh, understanding, and just recognizing that, we didn't come to this country to oppress people, but rather, due to the systems that
Mm.
lie, that's what was happened. That's how we've internalized it. And a lot of it also comes from, I think, even stepping a step farther into this would be um, colonization, especially in South Asian countries. This idea that white is best, and actual colorism and anti-blackness being something that was also becoming common in the Eastern world, and something that, in America, there's a lot of anti-blackness I've seen within the Asian community because of what people see as uh, African American on TV. There's just such little exposure, and I think media has perpetuated this model minority myth more. And that's really important to understand, because I've seen a lot of better representation in the last few years of Asian Americans on screen, um, even when stories are talked about on the news. But we still have a long ways to go to make sure that both people of color understand, as well as Asian Americans understand, our role in, uh, greater social justice.
And I'm glad when you talk about your role, right? And role implies, action.
Mm-hmm.
Roles imply, shifts in behavior, doing something, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's at home. And so what do you so as someone who identifies who is Asian American, someone who obviously experiences, oppression and marginalization, but then also benefits and experience privilege in some ways, especially in this context, what do you see as your role? Like, what do you offer to someone who's kind of just like, I mean, I didn't do this, right? Like, I'm just kind of this
Mm-hmm.
sort of well-intentioned perspective of I'm really just trying to succeed, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
really just trying to, do the best that I can. Um, and offer to someone perhaps with similar identities as your own, as sort of what their role is in this work, what their
Mm-hmm.
role is as someone experiencing oppression, but hey, also someone who, can be an ally and who can act in service of justice and equity.
Right. I think that's a really great question. I think there's so much that um, people like me can do. First, just thinking about self understanding, uh, to the point of, what are some things that you do? Just thinking about what are things in your life that are perpetuating this model minority myth? How are we potentially, um, covering up hate, racism, systemic oppression, things that we might experience, and justifying it as okay? I think that's
Mm,
often really seen in this community, especially since, we don't want to be seen as um, against people. I think it's a lot of fear. There's a fear of, not being accepted when you speak out against something that's solely something about your identity. And I think that's something that is new still for the Asian community, especially in this country. And I think a lot of times I've seen, uh, for people in my communities, what assumptions are we making about our peers, and what do
mm,
we see, and what standards are we holding ourselves to, especially in terms of achievement, friendship, allyship. I think that's really important. And thinking about, what kind of ally are we, especially to other people of color? Often I see Asian American, um, my experience of being in Asian American communities, there's not as much. I think the community is really strong, really full of culture, and very vibrant. And we often don't see the connections, the similarities between other people of color, other cultures, and cross collaborating, I think, is super important. Seeing what are the similarities in our oppression, the things we experienced as children, um, are definitely unique. And I'm not saying that, but uh, how can we use this as a way to connect and
mhm.
speak for voices that are often oppressed in our communities today, for people who may not get the benefit of the doubt in the classroom, who might be already seen due to implicit biases or unconscious biases as inferior. I often think of the school space and thinking about how Asian Americans, just reflecting on how I was treated differently compared to my peers who were also people of color, but Hispanic and Black. Why was I always, the line leader, or, considered someone who was very disciplined, even though everyone else in my classroom was too? It's just that they, it might have manifested differently. Their behavioral interpretations were different because of the color of their skin. And I also think as practitioners in this space, there's a lot of activism and just even taking the role of, being in charge of a support group, a dialogue space at your workplace, being part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion council, and using your power as an Asian American to not only show that Asian Americans go through a lot of oppression, but also to be a voice that might be seen as more powerful than someone who is Hispanic or Black in the space, but a voice to be an ally for them. I think we do have this unique role for being an ally for justice for all people. And I think we just need to harness that more and take consideration of the disparities that exist within our communities as Asian. Mental health is on the rise. Mental health illnesses are on the rise for people of Asian descent. Suicides are also on the rise for high schoolers and college kids, specifically who are Asian American. And I don't think people realize that much because they seem to be so high achieving. It's like when you look at them on a piece of paper, you see achievement, you see success, but what does that come down to their self-worth? And how have these model minority myths perpetuated that and created sort of a really poor health condition? So I also think it does come down to health too. So these are things I think that people who are either, allies to Asian American issues or Asian American themselves and in the space of wanting to do more can do.
And since you kind of teased it a little bit while it's top of mind for me, you talked about sort of like the working and the like overachieving. Also a cultural norm that doesn't come from nowhere, right? And so on a future episode, we actually gonna have Travis kind of talk through like sort of whiteness, right? And the whole like working ourselves to death. And the reason why that came up for me is because, as we know, especially in the context of race in this work, it is proximity rather to whiteness, right? That influences how we experience, this world, a race conscious world, right? Or a system. And I think that even influences this whole sort of model minority conversation, right? Proximity to whiteness, even as people of color.
I definitely agree with you. I think the proximity to whiteness is one of the main reasons that we, as Asian Americans, have, internalized this myth and perpetuated the stereotype of, our, achievement is our being instead of ourselves as our being. I think
that's really good.
Yeah, I think we tie it so much to our identity. I think our identity sometimes, becomes really minimized, and to a point where, what we can portray in proximity to whiteness is what we think is ourselves. And I think that's where a lot of the mental health concerns come in. A lot of the, overworking, the fatigue, without even realizing it.
All of this stuff is interconnected, y'all. All of it. So in your post, folks love like action, right? And so in your post, you offered some, pretty pointed feedback or practices rather to educators, policy makers, and even community members. And so for the folks who are listening, can you just elaborate on those?
Sure. So for educators, I think of, are you pushing students of color who aren't just Asian Americans to the same potential you're pushing Asian Americans? Are you looking at the African American student as, just as achieving, just as motivated? I think motivation is often seen as something that, takes time and care. Are we looking at misbehaviors in the classrooms as, are we treating them the same? I think that's really important as well. And I think often you have to take a step back and see, there are even times I think of myself, I'm not an educator by any means, but even in the classroom when I was growing up, even in college, there were assumptions that I think I had made in my head about certain people. And when they proved to not be true, I was like, wow. And, I think, and then you think like, oh, wow, but also, why am I so surprised? Why shouldn't I expect, this African American person to be more high achieving than I am, more motivated than I am, more passionate about something than I am? And that was a big realization of how much I had internalized this myth. So I think educators can look into that, especially for at a young age. I think a lot of these things were learned to me at a very young age. So especially kindergarten teachers, grade school. I really think educators should, take the time to, listen carefully and make sure that you are bringing out the voices of other students as well, and also treating the Asian American student just like any student, how they want to be treated, and not like some sort of, prized pedestal. And I think that's really important too for the mental health of all students in the space. For policymakers, I think a lot about the disaggregation of data. I think Asian and Pacific Islander is just too broad to encompass change for the various, very different communities in the Asian American space in America. How can we better take into consideration disparities in the Asian American community is really important. We often see, Asian Americans as high achieving, having, more wealth, but by no means is it intergenerational at all. It's really the start of growing wealth, but also there are so many low income Asian Americans, a lot of refugees, especially from Vietnam, who often struggle being seen as who they are and struggle in the space because there's so many assumptions being made about them, when in reality people are struggling, and we're putting everyone in a box that they don't want to be in. They want to be in a box that they don't want to be in a box. They want to be represented as who they are. And I think in terms of policies, we need to recognize that and disaggregate different groups of Asian Americans and get good data on who makes up our community and the disparities, especially with health, especially with access to care, income. These are huge things that we tend to generalize. And I think for true policy change that's specific to Asian Americans, we need to disaggregate that. And then lastly, I think just being a community member, being a person in your neighborhood, something I always ask are, what assumptions do we make about our Asian peers? Who are we seeing as high achieving or hardworking in our communities? And why? Why do we see this person as more high achieving than this other person? And who do we, see as, oh, they worked hard versus, they were, a result of affirmative action, things like that. I think those are very often internalized things, especially as higher education becomes more competitive. People want that edge, and people want to find excuse. People want to find an excuse to, justify their successes and failures. And how are we perpetuating certain things with the Asian identity in that space? I think it's a really great way to start dialogue in your communities, as well as, engage people in a conversation they've never had. I know most people who aren't South Asian or Asian American that I had grown up with didn't know what this was until I talked about it, with my own struggles with, anxiety, depression, being very internalized in the space, and also that connection of identity. Who am I versus what am I on paper?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was really eye-opening for people. And it's something that's, preventing our society from tackling root causes of injustice. So it's really a narrative that we have to unpack and reverse. And I think the first way to do that is to start talking about it more.
This is really, 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 really good stuff. And I think about the organizations that we support who, for example, have employee resource groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
Employee resource groups that, serve or that seek to amplify the experiences of different communities of color, be it Black employees, Asian employees. And when you talk about the role of dialogue, I think conversations around internalized oppression and how the
Mm-hmm.
norms and messages that we have learned show up in the workplace are an excellent, right? Just a really good start point. Or maybe not even a start point, but part of, because, we got to start with like, understanding who we are. Da, da, da. It's a really good opportunity, next opportunity to help folks or facilitate dialogue that get folks making the connection between, okay, this is who I am, this is where I've learned, and this is how it
Mm-hmm.
shows up in the workplace, right? A fairly, like, talk about another myth, merit, the whole like meritocracy myth, which is heavy, huge, big in workplace environments. Hey, these are some of the messages that show that, you know what? No, it's not really a meritocracy, and our experiences are different, and outcomes are different, and here's why. An excellent opportunity to get folks talking across groups, um, to affirm that even as we are uh, part of this subordinated groups, being people of color, our experiences are different.
Exactly.
And we each play a unique role, right, in moving our work around equity and inclusion forward.
Definitely. I
Because
completely agree.
so I just ask, just to wrap up our convo, why is, from your perspective, and I shared with this for some context, and maybe you already listened to it, Thamara, in the intro, I
Mm-hmm.
shared why this intra-personal work is so important, or at least my perspective on it. And so I just ask you, why is this intra-personal work, so important to our effectiveness, and what do you offer to leaders, CDOs, change agents who are seeking to grow in their understanding of equity work themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is really recognizing your own privileges, experiences, ways you were brought up, the culture you were surrounded by, even your communities, and figuring out how does that make me who I am today.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I ask myself a lot because I grew up in a predominantly white community, Midwestern, suburban. And over time, I've moved to different places, and that has really changed or really added to my worldview and, tweaked it every time I go through a new experience. And I think for CEOs, for leaders um, in any space, I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge where your beliefs, your values come from, your leadership styles, and dig one step deeper, why am I this type of leader? And why am I more, of a uh, direct communicator, indirect communicator, and acknowledging the privileges that people have. I think, especially for Asian Americans, I think we have to acknowledge that the history of our country kind of put us on a pedestal while bringing other people down. And the while bringing other people
Mm.
down is something we don't really talk about, even in the model minority mid space. I think we have to
Wow, bringing
acknowledge,
other people down. Wow. Yeah.
yeah, like I think we have to acknowledge that, and also see what we can do now. Sure, I wasn't alive during the civil rights movement, but that doesn't mean these issues don't exist today. So I really think that CEOs and leaders can think more about the history of their industries, the history of,
Mm.
their journey to where they were today, and be very open about that. I think just even sharing their own experiences, whether it was, a privilege or something they experienced that really, was a challenge or obstacle for them, is, I think, the first step to creating more inclusion in the workplace, encouraging other workers to be more comfortable recognizing that their privileges are privileges. I don't think we
They just
recognize.
are. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
they
just
just are
are.
privileges. And just acknowledging that and knowing that and being aware of how that changes actions, especially with people who don't have
Mhm.
those privileges, and what they can do to, help people who may not have those privileges in a way. So I think
Mhm.
that's really the first step, acknowledging and acting upon. I think first the acknowledgement step is huge because we don't want to think about, I think we often always think about the things that are hardest for us, the things, our challenges or obstacles, but we don't think of what we already had and are taking for granted. Um, and I think that's one of the most important steps to creating a more inclusive workplace, inclusive communities, cultures, and just being a really good ally and advocate for justice.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. I shared with the folks, our listeners, Dahmer, that we have a reflection guide to
Mm-hmm.
support folks in reading, listening, and then just like unpacking this stuff for themselves. And so I would just offer our listeners to, reflect on some of what we discussed in this episode. What resonated with you most, perhaps what didn't. And what ways have you observed or perhaps experienced and or perpetuated this model minority myth in your world? And really think about, based on the groups, the identity groups that you're part of, what are some of the messages that you've internalized about your identity, your groups, that perhaps seem positive, but could have a negative impact on our broader quest for equity, justice, and inclusion? I appreciated the call out of, sure, this stereotype, this myth lifted this community up, but hey, and it also brought or was in service of, oppressing, bringing another group down. That's so important to acknowledge
Mm-hmm.
and call out. In a lot, you said it, a lot of this work, this interpersonal work, the first part is just kind of just knowing. And the more we know and understand and are aware of ourselves, the more we can begin to enact, right, all of this in our behaviors, in our systems, in our policies, in our spheres of influence. Any other thoughts, final thoughts, Summer, you want to share with the folks who are
Mm-hmm.
listening before we wrap up?
Well, I would just like to say thank you, Brittany, and everyone listening. I think just even listening to this podcast and learning about these topics of internalized oppression are so important and is a step towards greater self
Mhm.
understanding. And I encourage everyone, no matter what your identity is, to explore this topic more in your spaces, whether it's, asking your um, peer who identifies as Asian American what they think about it, and just encouraging dialogue and talk about this will, I think, is the first step to change of, breaking this narrative apart and dismantling this cycle.
Bold,
Yeah.
inclusive conversations, y'all. It's a
Mm-hmm.
movement. All right, so definitely, you all perhaps already know because I've said it before. The Winters Group is everywhere you can think of on social media: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, YouTube. The Winters Group. The reflection guide, if you have not downloaded it already, is on our website, wintersgroup.com. Download it and engage in this conversation and some reflection on your own. We use this John Dewey quote, right? We don't just learn from our experiences, we learn by reflecting on them. And so you can even use the guide as a way, as Dharma shared, to get conversations started with your peers, right? Print it out, distribute it, listen in, and use some of what we have shared on Inclusion Solution Live to engage in some dialogue yourselves. We even have a few resources on the site for engaging in bold, inclusive conversations, norm setting, all that good stuff. As y'all well know, we end our learning experiences and commitment to live inclusively. And so I'm going to share that, and then we are going to sign off. I commit to be intentional in living inclusively. to spending more time getting to know myself and understanding my culture. It is in understanding myself that I am better positioned to understand others. I will acknowledge that I don't know what I don't know, but I will not use what is unconscious as an excuse. I will be intentional in exposing myself to difference. If I don't know, I will ask. If I am asked, I will assume positive intent. Most importantly, I will accept my responsibility in increasing my own knowledge and understanding. I commit to speaking up and speaking out, even when I am not directly impacted, for there is no such thing as neutrality in the quest for equity, justice, and inclusion. I will strive to accept and not just tolerate, respect, even if I don't agree, and be curious, not judgmental. I commit to pausing and listening. I will be empathetic to the experiences and perspectives of my others. I will use my privilege positively and get comfortable with my own discomfort. I commit to knowing, getting, and doing better than I did yesterday, keeping in mind my commitment to live inclusively is a journey, not a destination. Until next time, folks, we will talk to you soon. Thanks again, Thamara. Thank
Thank
you, thank you,
you.
thank you, thank you. And hope you all will listen in for our next episode. Bye bye.